We all experience losses in our life, metaphorical deaths, if you will. Sometimes those things happen slowly over time, like my teenage fantasy of becoming a rock star, which started out as possible and then became highly improbable and finally became absurd. Maybe you wanted to play professional sports at some time in your past and eventually had to come to the realization that that ship had sailed. Sometimes the things that we lose happen more suddenly, more unexpectedly, like the abrupt end of a relationship or the loss of a job. And of course, the most consequential of the things that we lose, the greatest metaphorical death, is actual death. We all experience the death of loved ones over the course of our life, and barring the return of Jesus, we all expect that our lives will end in death. And so we live in a world where death gets the last word. Or do we? In the next I am statement that Jesus gives in John's Gospel, Jesus challenges the way that we understand death, and in so doing changes the way that we live our lives. Now, the story that I want to talk about, the Raising of Lazarus, really starts in the previous chapter, in chapter 10, when Jesus narrowly escapes being stoned to death in Jerusalem. He and his disciples escape across the Jordan River and are breathing a sigh of relief at their safety when a messenger arrives that says that Jesus' good friend Lazarus is deathly ill. Now, you might expect Jesus to jump into action, to run to see his friend and to save him, but that's not what Jesus does. Jesus seems to dawdle, waiting 2 days before he tells his disciples that Lazarus is dead and that they are going to raise him. Now, the disciples themselves have breathed a sigh of relief that Jesus hadn't run to Lazarus' side, because Lazarus lives in Bethany, which is a mere 3 kilometers from Jerusalem. So the danger that they had just escaped was what they would have been heading back into. And now that Lazarus is dead, it seems even more nonsensical to go risk their lives. But when the disciples realize that they can't dissuade Jesus, Thomas sums up the attitude of all of them when he says, "Let us go that we may die with him." By the time Jesus arrives in Bethany, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Now, I'd just like to point out that if Jesus had jumped to it and left immediately as soon as the messenger had arrived, he still would have showed up 2 days after Lazarus' death. And so it wouldn't have actually made a difference to his friend's life or death. But it's also worth noting that Jews had a particular way of understanding the relationship of the body and spirit at death. They believed that a spirit stayed close to its body for 3 days following death. In that culture, they didn't embalm bodies, and of course it's quite warm, so after 3 days, decomposition would begin. And so when that started to happen, they had assumed that all hope was lost and that there was nothing that could be done. Even a miracle would be too much to ask to save a person who'd already been dead more than 3 days. And so Jesus arrives in Bethany, and Lazarus has 2 sisters, Martha and Mary. And we're going to start where Jesus encounters Martha. So that's John chapter 11, verses 20 to 27. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know that he'll rise again at the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you're the Messiah, the Son of God who is coming into the world." Now, in order to understand a little bit about what's going on between them, we need to understand a little bit about what Jews thought about what happened after you die. In the early Old Testament, there's not really a lot of talk about what happens after death. But in the period of time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, There were a lot of Jews who tried to live faithfully to God's law and were persecuted and killed for the effort. And as they tried to make sense of what it means for God to be just, they had to deal with this reality. In the Old Testament prophetic books, there is a theme that comes up over and over again about the day of the Lord, the day when God will intervene in history and punish the wicked and reward the righteous. And so the Jews, looking at that day, imagined that it must involve God's resurrection of the righteous dead, because how could God reward the righteous and avoid rewarding the people who had paid the highest price for their righteousness? And so there was an expectation that at the end of history, all of the righteous would rise and live with God. So when Jesus tells Martha that Lazarus is going to rise, it probably strikes her as some sort of religious platitude, like at a funeral when someone says, "Oh, I'm sure they're in a better place," which we hope is true, but at the same time, it often is not a very comforting thing for the person who is going through the grief that they are at that point in time. And so Mary sort of shrugs off what Jesus says and doesn't really allow it to permeate her. She doesn't really believe it in her bones. She just sort of assents, yeah, I believe that, I guess. And we're going to see later on from her actions that she doesn't really believe. Now, next, as the story progresses, Martha goes to get her sister Mary, and Mary comes to Jesus. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, the Jews who had come along with her were also weeping. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But, Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen, and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Now, when we read stories in Scripture, sometimes we fall victim to the idea of, or we fall victim to losing our wonder at the things that are happening. We're so used to reading stories about Jesus' miracles that it can become a no big deal, right? Like, oh, Peter and Jesus went to the market, they had some food, cleansed a couple leopards, raised a dead person, and went home and had lunch. All in a morning's work. But of course, if you were a person witnessing this event, you would have found it remarkable, astounding, unbelievable. It's helpful for us to try and bracket out our reading of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Oftentimes when we read the Gospels, we sort of turn the 4 accounts of Jesus into one big sort of soup in our mind. And if we try and understand what's happened in John's Gospel to this point, we understand that Jesus has been gradually revealing his authority to his followers. He shows them that he has authority over scarcity in the conversion of water into wine and in the feeding of the 5,000. He shows them that he has sovereignty over nature when he walks on water. He shows them that he has sovereignty over over physical illness and the human body when he heals a man born blind. But to this point, Jesus has not shown his disciples that he can raise the dead. They probably believe that that is even beyond his power to do. And so this is one last revelation that Jesus must give them, and this is the final revelation that he gives them before we kind of move into the terminal phase of this gospel. Jesus now shows them that his authority is not limited to the things that he showed them already, but that his authority extends to even death. He's probably reluctant to show them this because he surmises, rightly, that once he shows people that he is Lord even over death, that they're going to try and kill him. The very next story in the gospel after this is how those who oppose Jesus move from wishing he was dead to actively planning to kill him. So Jesus has authority over death. What does that mean? Well, if Jesus can raise a dead person then, Jesus can raise a dead person now. The Pharisees believed that the resurrection was going to be for the righteous, the people who could tick the boxes of having kept the law the most rigorously. And so they had this check box, a checklist, if you will. Oh, I was circumcised on the 8th day. Check. I don't eat pork and shellfish. Check. I keep the Sabbath day perfectly. Check. But when we look in the story at who Jesus raises from the dead, it's not the person who can check the most boxes in the list. It is Jesus' friend. That might offend our modern egalitarian sensibilities, but Jesus raises his friend, not the person who is able to tick the most boxes. But the good news, of course, is that Jesus offers his friendship to anyone who will receive it. And so, we all don't have to be the people who can tick all the boxes, who have to live perfect lives in order to be the people who can receive this gift from Jesus. We need to be his friends and his followers. Something else that we should note, an implication of Jesus' resurrection of Lazarus, is that it shows us a different way of living. Jesus lives a life characterized by death so that he can die a death characterized by life. Let me explain. Jesus does everything that he does in a metaphorical way of dying. He gives away what is helpful to him, what is comfortable to him. He gives away his status and his power. Jesus could spend eternity with the Father and the Spirit, but he chooses to come down and slum with people like us. He chooses to heal the sick instead of to do whatever it is he wants to do. And at the Last Supper in John's Gospel, Jesus gets down and washes his disciples' feet. Washing the feet of people was the work of slaves, and not just any slave, the lowest slave in a household. Jesus lowers himself to the absolute bottom and then tells his disciples that that's how they ought to live as well. So everything that Jesus does prior to his actual death is a literal death, and it is the example that he sets for his disciples. He tells them that they are supposed to walk the way of the cross, and they do. Church tradition tells us that all of the disciples, with the exception of Judas, who hangs himself after betraying Jesus, and John, all died violent deaths for the sake of the gospel. But this idea that we should give what is important to us, what is helpful to us, what is comfortable to us away, doesn't make any sense without the promise of the resurrection. Think about the prevailing wisdom of our age. If it feels good, do it. Look after number one. Seize the day. You have one life to live, so you need to wring every last bit of enjoyment and pleasure out of it that you can. If it is true that at the end of our earthly life, that is the end of everything, then there's a certain logic to that way of thinking. But if, on the other hand, God raises us to a new life in which he rewards us for the ways in which we died in this life, then suddenly the logic of this age turns on its head. Imagine you had a very awkward dining experience. I was a missionary in Hungary, and my friend Eric, who was a missionary with me, he and I had to go to renew our visa. So we crossed over the border into Slovakia, and while we were across the border, we decided to go have lunch at a restaurant. So we went and we waited in this restaurant for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for a seat. Finally, the hostess comes and she beckons for us to follow her, so we follow her to the back of the restaurant, and she motions for us to get into a booth. So we slide into the booth and come face to face with two other patrons on the other side of the booth who are just finishing their meal. We don't speak any Slovakian, they don't speak any English, and we just sort of stare at each other. Made for a rather awkward dining experience. Now, if that happened to you at your favorite restaurant, and the owner came up to you and said, hey, sorry for that inconvenience. To make it up to you, I'm going to give you a dinner on the house next time you're in. You might say, okay, well, that takes some of the sting away from this experience that I had. But imagine instead, the owner of the restaurant comes up to you and says, you know what? Thanks for putting up with that. I'm going to give you free food for life. All you can eat. Anytime you want to come in, we'll feed you anything you want to eat for free. That might change your perspective on an awkward dining experience, wouldn't it? Suddenly that thing that annoyed you, that you had to sit across from some people that you didn't know, seems like a fortunate event because it seems like such a small price to have to pay in order to enjoy such a bountiful reward. Well, in keeping with this analogy, Jesus has some bad news. He's going to spoil supper. But he's going to offer you something so much better in compensation that the spoiling of supper is going to seem like nothing. You might be asked to sit across from some people that you don't like. You might not get the food that you ordered. But in the end, you know that you are going to reap an all-you-can-eat buffet of the greatest blessing that God can imagine. The Apostle Paul knew suffering on account of the gospel. He was beaten within an inch of his life on multiple occasions. He was shipwrecked and left in the open sea on more than one occasion. He was imprisoned. He was looked down on. He was gossiped about. And when he reflects on the suffering of his apostolic calling, he puts it in a resurrection perspective. In 2 Corinthians 4, verses 16 and 17, he says, "We do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day, for our light and momentary troubles," that's what he considers being beaten within an inch of his life, thrown in prison and shipwrecked, "are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." In other words, the suffering that he was enduring, that was real suffering, is so insignificant compared to the promise that God has given to us that it seems like a no-brainer. Something that he would gladly endure, knowing that God is going to reward him. So how does this belief in Jesus being the resurrection and the life, how does it affect the way that we approach life? Well, first of all, and the most obvious example, is that it changes the way that we look towards the loss of believing loved ones. When we lose someone, it hurts. But it hurts differently when we believe that God will raise that person. It always is painful to walk through the experience of parting from a loved one. Even if that means, that somebody is going away on a long trip and you won't see them for a while, there is a grieving process that we go through. Jesus doesn't delegitimize the pain that Mary and Martha feel at the loss of their brothers. He cries with them. But at the same time, being parted from a person for a time is very different from being parted from them for all time. And so as we consider the loss of our loved ones, and as we grieve those losses, we grieve them as those with hope that we will see this other person again, not with the conviction that we will never see them again. Another way that Jesus' promise of resurrection changes our practical expression of faith is that if God is calling us to a life of sacrifice, believing in the resurrection equips us to make those sacrifices for the sakes of others. If God asks you to give up the money that you were going to spend on your vacation so that you could help out a single mom whose car broke down, it puts it in a different perspective. Now you understand that God will reward you and that you're giving up something of value, but you will get something of even greater value. It becomes an investment in the future. If God asks you to lay aside your comfort and spend time with people at the margins of society, you might say, well, this is an uncomfortable thing for me to spend my time doing, but at the same time, I could find joy in the process of meeting people, and they could surprise me. But even if I didn't, God will reward my faithfulness in ways that are far greater than the inconvenience that I face right now. But the problem with all of this is that it only works if we allow this truth to permeate us, to go into our bones, that we actually believe what Jesus says. When God asks us to make sacrifices and promises us that He will raise us to a new life in which He will reward our righteousness, do we think that He's merely spouting off religious-sounding platitudes, or do we sincerely believe that He's making us a promise about the future? And so when Martha goes to the tomb and Jesus says, "Open the tomb, roll away the stone," she protests because she doesn't actually believe that Jesus' assurance is anything other than words. And we may find ourselves struggling to obey Jesus if we don't believe His promise. And so when He promises us to do something scary, are we looking for a miracle? Or are we just worried about the smell?